All right, I think I have the microphone issues figured out. Welcome back to Knowledge in Progress. This will be our first live episode, so episode 1. Episode 0 was recorded offline and posted last week. So, in this channel, the goal is to show you what it's like to do research, to show you what it's like to find answers to questions you might have if you're not already familiar with the topic, right? How do you learn something new? And last week we started looking at this question of why ecosystems are more stable when there's more species present. And to do this, we created an Obsidian Vault. We talked a little bit about how that was put together. And then we started figuring out how to approach this question. Now, let's go ahead and jump over to that Obsidian Vault. And I apologize, my volume was a little bit high there. Let me get that dialed in. That should be better. So this is our Obsidian Vault. All right, we have our question note. Why are ecosystems more stable when they contain more species? We had a couple of different concepts that we figured we needed to look at. So we have ecological stability, we have ecosystem, and we have biodiversity as concepts that we want to examine. And we found 2 sources related to a few of these points that we started off with. Now, in Obsidian, we can click on these nodes to actually open up the node that we're looking at. So our question here, why are ecosystems more stable when they contain more species, is something that we are beginning to investigate. Right? We had an initial thought here, right? It's always good to figure out what your starting position is. Where are you beginning your work? And in this case, if there are a lot of species in an ecosystem, then if a species disappears, there will be others that can fill the same role. That was my initial belief, my initial hypothesis, and then we're going to start off looking at different sources. We realized in order to answer this question, we needed to have an understanding of what an ecosystem is. We need to have some understanding of ecological stability, and we should probably have a definition of biodiversity. So we created those notes, and we can click on ecosystem, right? We have a summary here. We're going to want to flesh this out a bit more today. We have all of the organisms in an area and the non-living things with which they interact, as well as the interactions themselves. That was basically summarized from the Wikipedia page. Again, we generally don't want to use Wikipedia as an academic source, mostly because Wikipedia is a secondary source, right? People writing Wikipedia articles are taking other primary sources and incorporating them into their work. What we want is those initial primary sources, right? Where did the folks who were writing the Wikipedia article start off? So it's generally not a good practice to cite Wikipedia directly, but we can use it as a starting point, a navigational aid. And if I open this up, I have absolutely no idea if I'm still live. The browser window that was live streaming cut off, but we're going to find out here in a second. All right, it looks like we are back. Excuse the technical issues. We will get them sorted out over time as I learn how any of this works. So what I was trying to do, so this is our Wikipedia page for an ecosystem. And one of the things that we can see here is that we have these superscripts, right? So we have a superscript 2 here. This links to some textbook. if you want to find a source that you can cite, the best thing to do is to click on this link, and it'll bring you down to a citation for the sources. Right, so we have here an article in the Journal of Ecology. This is the source you could use, so we could follow the link to this. And I have no idea if this is something we want to use today, but let's see if it even opens. We may have to search for the title. Yeah, we'll have to search for the title to find it. But the point stands. If we want to find this, we're going to go ahead, copy that. We can put it into Google Scholar. And there's our article. So we can open this up. There we go. So I hope that closing my browser window that I was using to run the stream isn't going to cause any problems for us. It looks like OBS still has us open. So we'll find out what happens here as we proceed. But we've got our article here now. We've got all of the information we would need. We can read the paper and get all of that information. So if I go back to Wikipedia. Right, so we have this reference section, and we have all of these different references that we can find in this way. Right, we have indicators for monitoring biodiversity. We can go ahead and go into Google Scholar, paste in the title, and have a look at that paper. Right, so this is how you find sources with Wikipedia. We don't cite the Wikipedia article itself, we find the sources through Wikipedia. Now, let's go back to our vault. So we're going to want to have a clearer definition of an ecosystem here. We'll continue filling that in. We were looking at biodiversity. And here we were citing a source already, right? We have a footnote to this Caldwell biodiversity paper. This was a chapter in a book. This is the Princeton Guide to Ecology book. But I can go ahead and put that in, and we will bring that back up because we're probably going to want that today. And if I remember correctly, we had to use this link because one of the other links was dead. So here we have a nice description of all of these vocabulary terms, right? This was something that was interesting to me, right? So although E.O. Wilson first used the term biodiversity in the literature in 1988, I got curious about that line. We read it last week. I actually went to the library and I found the book, E.O. Wilson editor, Biodiversity. And I think this would be a good source to add, right? There's some good information in here, certainly. This is actually a collection of papers that were presented on in the first biodiversity conference a few years before this was published. So this book is actually not the very first reference to the term biodiversity, but it is a very early source, and it's a collection of the works presented in that first reference to biodiversity. So let's actually add that particular source in. We can hit our new source or new note, and we're going to call this, we're going to leave this blank. We're going to put a template in for a source. Now, we need a BibTeX entry here, and we can find that by going back to Google Scholar. And let's just do biodiversity. I already pulled this one up, biodiversity, E.O. Wilson, 1988. There's a link to Google Books, and we can hit Cite. And remember that if you go to BibTeX, we can get our actual BibTeX file. Control-C, copy that, and we're going to put that in our BibTeX section right here. And this citation key is going to be our title for the note. Now, why did we save this? One of the first references to the word, and you know what, let's link this, biodiversity. Now, remember square brackets in Obsidian will create a link. So if we click on our text here, this takes us back to the biodiversity page. We want to back this up. Now, unfortunately, there is not actually a good definition of biodiversity in this short section of the book titled Biodiversity that I have read. I'm going to want to read the rest of this book eventually, but I read the introduction by E.O. Wilson, and there's definitely references to the number of species and the amount of genetic information, but there's not a biodiversity is defined as. Actually, at this point, biodiversity was a marketing term that was used as the name of a conference, so there may not have been a need at the time to define the term. I did find a really interesting quote in here. So we're going to put that in. The quote that I got was this, referring to rainforests. So, referring to rainforests, I guess rainforest should be 2 words. This says, first, although these habitats, again, rainforests, cover only 7% of the Earth's land surface, they contain more than half the species in the entire world biota. Right? So these are very diverse ecosystems. What's interesting, though, is that we typically think of rainforests as these incredibly vulnerable ecosystems, right? They're very sensitive. So that makes me wonder, if we have this question, why are ecosystems more stable when they contain more species? Is that even true? Is that a true statement, right? Rainforests are incredibly biodiverse, and yet we consider them to be a very vulnerable habitat. So we're going to go ahead and put this in here and say, is this always true? What about rainforests? And we can superscript a new footnote here, and this is going to be Wilson 1988 biodiversity as a citation. There we go. And now it's created the footnote at the bottom of the question. And we're going to be able to look at this again in the future. Maybe this is a question we'll research at another time. So, interesting book. I'm going to have to read the rest of this, but we're going to need to take some time with that. That's not something I'm going to do live on stream. It wouldn't be very exciting for you if I'm just sitting here with a book in front of me, not talking. So give me some time on that one. Now, let's go back to this question that we had. And we were looking at ecosystems, right? So one thing that we're really going to want to do here is find a definition of an ecosystem. So let's go back to Scholar and see what we can find. Ecosystem definitions. You know, I wonder if the Pearson Guide to Ecology actually has a paper on that. Let me make sure I've got our source here. Princeton Guide to Ecology. Let's see if Princeton Guide to Ecology has one of those nice definition pages. Can we define ecosystems? That's an interesting search. Let's actually see. Is that in? No, that's in something else. But let's have a look at it. So we've got this. This is Acta Biotheoretica. That's not an article that or journal I'm that familiar with. But let's see. Sound definition of its basic concept is fundamental to any scientific discipline. That is a statement. There will be some arguments about that, but we would like to try to define our terms. So let's see, we've got philosophy of definitions. That might be interesting for a different question. Definition versus description. Let's see. An ecosystem is an interaction structure of organisms and their inorganic environment. So we've got a source here. I would like to not have that covering my text, which is open and to a certain degree capable of self-regulation. This summarizing and nowadays generally valid definition is the result of ecological observation and research over the centuries. That's interesting. Let's see if something shows up here. This is someone quoting someone else. This is more of a summary of how people have approached the idea of defining ecology or ecosystem. Let's see. Ecological units, definition, and application. That could be helpful. Kurt Jacks again, okay. Let's see, ecosystem. Ecological units, aggregations of objects. Here we go. The most basic and widely used terms, population, community, and ecosystem, will be used throughout this text with the following generic definitions. Ecosystem is an assemblage of organisms of different types, either species or life forms, together with their abiotic environment in space and time. That's a nice, clear definition. Let's use that. So we will need to create a new source here. So we'll create a new note. We will need the citation. We'll take our citation key and make that the name of the note. And we'll say here, definitions of ecosystem, community, and population. And we'll grab all three of these. I have a feeling that community and population will come up again in the future. That might just be my bias because I'm an ecologist, but we're going to grab these and jump with them. So we're going to create a quote, ecosystem. That's going to be here. And we'll format this, make it look nice. And we'll do the same thing for community and population. And you know what? That's actually... And we can create links to notes that don't exist yet. We'll get the definition for community. And if we ever need the community note, this will link to it automatically. So here we have a community is just an assemblage of organisms of different types in space and time. So we can see that an ecosystem contains a community, but also contains the abiotic environment in space and time. And then population is the last one we want. We'll go ahead and copy this. Is a group of individual organisms of the same species in space and time. So this is a group in space and time of organisms of the same species. So a community is a collection of populations. An ecosystem is a community and the non-living components with which it interacts. So now that we have this, we can go back to our ecosystem, and we'll say in our discussion here something like the ecological unit consisting of all of the living things in a space and time, as well as the non-living components of that space and time. And we will put a footnote here, and this is going to link to Jax. Now, one question that is in my mind here, and we'll leave this as an open question, we don't have to answer it right away, is how do you put boundaries on the space and time? How do you say this space, this is the edge where we leave the space of one ecosystem and move into the space of another ecosystem? So question, how do we set boundaries to the space and time that belong to an ecosystem? Could be an interesting question in the future. But we don't have to answer it right this second. We now have a good definition of an ecosystem. So if we go back to our question here, we have our first keyword sorted out. We also want to look at containing more species, right? We were talking about biodiversity. One thing we can put in here in the discussion is that other source that I pulled, the book, right? So we could say first discussed the term was first used in literature just before 1988. And we can add another footnote here, and we'll cite Wilson. So we have the variety of life, right? And we need to ask the question here, how do we quantify life? Quantify variety. Right. We say variety here. That word's doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting. So we probably at some point would like to define that. So how do we put a number on this? So now if we look at our footnotes, we have our two sources. We have a discussion with a definition. We have a summary. And we have that one defined. So that leads us to the big one that we were working on last time, which is ecological stability. So if we open this up, we have a summary. An ecosystem is stable if it can recover quickly from small changes. And we were starting to look at some sources here. One of the sources we had pulled was this Peterson source. Ecological resilience, biodiversity, and scale. So let's get that back and we'll keep working on this. Right, we found 3 different I don't know what this is. We found 4 different models. We had the species diversity model. This one, I believe, was originally coined by Charles Darwin. Let me double check that, but I think that's what the source said. All right. Yeah, so this one was coined by Darwin in 1859. We should put that note in there. That's an interesting little fact. Right? We'll say coined by Charles Darwin in 1859. Yes, it's not scientifically supported, but it was the first idea that was being presented. All right. The next one that was being presented is this idiosyncratic model, essentially saying that different species have vastly different ways of interacting with each other. And what we care about is the interactions between species, not necessarily just how many species are present. So in the native range of fire ants in South America, we have some interaction between fire ants and all of the other organisms in that area. On the other hand, when they became introduced to the United States, they started doing a lot of damage in terms of reducing biodiversity. So we have here a potential difference in the impact of a species on ecosystem stability, depending on how it interacts with the other species in that ecosystem. Let's see. Many ecosystem studies have revealed that despite dissimilar species compositions, ecosystems can have striking ecological similarities. So that suggests that it isn't as much to do with the particular species that are present, but more to do with the type of ecosystem we're looking at. So that leads us to the rivet and passengers and drivers models. So we can say that the idiosyncratic model cannot be complete because there's a lot of similarity between similar types of ecosystems, regardless of the species that make up those ecosystems. So a lake in one part of the world might have an ecosystem very similar to a lake in a different part of the world, even though the actual species that are there are different. So we'll make a note here. We'll say this does not seem to work all the time because a lot of ecosystems share similar structures even if their species differ. We'll say, for example, lakes in different parts of the world. All right, so we have our idiosyncratic model taken care of. That's probably not the answer to our question either. So that leaves us with the rivet model, where it says that there's some number of species that are necessary for ecological stability. If you have more than that, then that means you can lose a lot of species before you start losing stability. And then the drivers and passengers model says that some species contribute a lot to the stability of an ecosystem while others don't. So if you have a lot of biodiversity, right, you can lose a lot of passenger species as long as you keep your drivers. So let's have a look at these and make sure we're understanding these correctly. This is a very short thing. So this is important. Compensation masks ecosystem degradation, because while a degraded system may function similarly to an intact system, The loss of redundancy decreases the system's ability to withstand disturbance or further species removal, right? So using the airplane wing as a model, right? If you take a bunch of rivets off of an airplane wing, the plane will fly just fine. But if something goes wrong, it is way more likely that that wing is going to come off. That's worth taking a note of here. So we'll say something like this can hide ecological damage because while an ecosystem can function with reduced biodiversity, it becomes more sensitive to future degradation. Okay, so the rivet model seems like it's pretty solid. Let's review this drivers and passengers model real quick. We'll say this is we should probably talk about ecological engineers and keystone species at some point in this series. So let's actually make a note here. So say drivers might be, and we'll make some links here. Or keystone species. This is a note that I'm taking because it's interesting to me. It doesn't necessarily add much to our answer right now, but we could definitely look at this in the future. But you can imagine something like a beaver, right? Beavers build dams which create ponds in areas that didn't have ponds before. If you remove that beaver, all of the wildlife that depends on the pond is going to go away, right? So beavers are really important to the ecosystem that they're in, so they're going to be considered drivers. A single species of frog that lives in that beaver pond may be a passenger, right? There's lots of frogs. If you lose one, there's still other frogs that can fill those functions, so the ecosystem will continue onwards. On the other hand, if we lose the beaver, none of the frogs are going to be there, and the ecosystem collapses. All right. So we have a good summary here of our different models. It looks like rivet or drivers and passengers are both good. Let's look at the rest of the paper real quick, and we'll skim through this and see if something useful shows up. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the authors here are arguing for the drivers and passengers model because they put it last, and they put the weakest model first. So I'm guessing they're in order. So here it looks like they're comparing drivers and passengers. So we have overlap between functional overlap between species. That's an interesting idea. So maybe there's multiple species that fill a particular function, like I mentioned, the frogs, right? They all eat bugs, they all live in the water, they're all doing basically frog things. So there's a lot of overlap there, is how I'm seeing that. And we can see that in drivers and passengers, we have this stair-step pattern on variation in ecological function among species. So as you add more species, is that what this means? Let's see. Okay, so the x-axis here is species richness. The y-axis is variation in ecological function. So drivers and passengers says that most of the time, as you add more species, you're going to follow this horizontal line. You're not adding a lot of function. But then you suddenly add a new species, and that species ends up being really important and drives the functions way up. Right? And then we have a bunch of species that do something that something else already does, and so forth and so forth. And if we have a lot of overlap, that's a much smoother curve. If we don't have a lot of overlap, that is really just a stair step. With the rivets model, if there's little overlap, every species adds some degree of function, and that more or less continues. But if we have lots of overlap in functions, then when we add species, the first few species that we add are all doing unique things. But eventually we're going to get some species that's doing something that's already being done, right? Maybe we're adding another species of frog up here, and it's doing something that one of our earlier frogs was doing. So we now have pretty clear descriptions. This is actually a nice figure. Let's take figure 5 and take a quick note on that. Because I made a comment, we can add a section here. So we'll say memorable figures. We'll get rid of this because we don't need it anymore. Figure 5 compares the rivets and drivers and passengers models in terms of the effect of number of species on the ecosystem functions being performed. All right, resilience. Engineering resilience is the rate at which a system returns to a single steady or cyclic state following a perturbation. Ecological resilience is a measure of the amount of change or disruption that is required to transform a system from being maintained by one set of mutually reinforcing processes and structures to a different set of processes and structures. So that's something we probably want. So it's not the only definition, but it seems like one that makes sense. So let's copy that and we'll use that quote. All right. So now we might have all the parts we need to answer our question. Let's have a look here. So we have, this should be below ecological resistance. Or ecological resilience, there we go. Okay, so we should probably go back to ecosystem stability and tie this in, right? So this is the amount of disruption that is needed to change. This is the processes and structures. So that's pretty much one ecosystem type to another ecosystem type. We'll go here. I'll say the amount of disruption needed to transform an and we'll link here ecosystem. From one type to another type. Let's see if they've given an example. looks like if we want to we've got a gravity-based metaphor, but that's not really helpful. So we'll leave that for now. So we have an answer here. We have the amount of disruption needed to transform an ecosystem from one type to another type. And we should also put our footnote here. This is going to be Peterson. Okay, so let's have a look at what has happened to our vault real quick. Just let's open up the graph view. So we'll see we've got a lot more nodes in here. These gray nodes are nodes that we've linked to that we don't have notes for yet. So they don't exist yet. We have a couple more sources. Let's drag some stuff around here just for clarity. We still have our 3 concepts. We have ecosystem, ecological stability, and biodiversity. Each of them has a source now, so we have some evidence that we can use to build up the answer to our question. We still need to go back and say that we have our rivets model and our drivers and passengers model here. And then we have all 3 of our concepts filled out, so then we can put together an answer to our question. So we'll go to ecological stability, and we'll make a note here. So 2 possible mechanism tying link that biodiversity to stability. Rivets model, and we're going to put that in quotes. Model suggests that an ecosystem needs a minimum number of species to remain stable. More species means that you could lose more before hitting that threshold. And then we have drivers and passengers. Model states that a few species are responsible for the majority of stability. Others have functions that can be performed by different species. And we should also footnote these. And we can just click on the same Peterson footnote here, because they're all coming off the same source. Okay. That looks reasonably good. So let's have a look now at the question. So we have our concepts put together. So let's now put together a current understanding of the answer to this question. We'll say start at this point, just start writing. A species does not cause it to experience a big change in ecological structure. Actually, this would be an irreversible change in ecological structure. And instead of saying does not, let's be more subtle here. The does not is very strong. Let's say if the loss of a species is less likely to cause an irreversible change in ecological structure. There are two potential explanations here. The first is that each species contributes to stability. A minimum number of species is required for resilience. If a ecosystem is biodiverse, it can lose more species before the number drops too low to support the system. Apparently we hyphenate biodiverse. This is known as the rivets model. The other hypothesis is that some species are essential for maintaining ecosystem stability, while others are more redundant. This is the drivers and passengers model. Loss of passenger species does not greatly reduce stability, but loss of driver species does. This is also a potential explanation, I'm thinking, for the rainforest situation, right? I don't know if it's the case for rainforests, and it's worth looking into. But what if some ecosystems just have a higher number of drivers, right? Maybe there's an ecosystem that needs a lot of drivers in order to stay stable. And if you lose a species, it's very likely that you lose a driver because most of the species are drivers. You can compare that to a different ecosystem where maybe you have a handful of drivers and the rest of the species are passengers. If you lose a species there, then that would mean that you wouldn't have as big of an impact on the overall stability. That's a good open question as well. Let's put that in here, actually. We'll say in the drivers, well, put that in quotes, drivers and passengers model, how do ecosystems differ in stability if, for example, they have a lot of passengers or very few. Let's actually change this to drivers. Are ecosystems with more drivers less stable? Because I'm thinking about coral reefs too, right? Reefs are also biodiversity hotspots. There's a lot of species that live on coral reefs, but they're also considered to be very sensitive ecosystems. They're very delicate. There's a lot of things that can go wrong there. So that would suggest that maybe the question isn't complete, right? Why are ecosystems more stable when they contain more species? In many cases, they are, because of either the rivets or the drivers and passengers model. But this is not necessarily always going to be the case, because there are some ecosystems that seem to break this rule. So let's rank our confidence here. Let's set this to, we'll say we have moderate confidence in our sources. The sources are good, but the application of the sources doesn't leave me with really strong confidence, right? This question right here, I mean, this one is what's keeping me from being 100% confidence. So let's say, what about the ecosystems that are sensitive but biodiverse, such as rainforests and coral reefs? Okay, we're gonna, there we go. We'll just add it to the dictionary. There we go. So we've now answered our first question, right? We have an understanding of our answer. We have a degree of confidence. The sources are good, but we have a follow-up question that needs to be answered for us to get to high confidence. We have a few things to consider if we wanted to dive deeper into this. We have a few directions we could go. We have 3 different concepts that we use to answer this question. Let's link these real quick. So we have ecosystem. That's going to link to we want stable linked, so this is going to be ecological stability. And let's see. We'll take biodiverse, and I do not want that hyphen there. If it underlines it again, we will add it to our dictionary, but I think it's fine now. So we're going to do this. Biodiversity. Cool. So now our question has clickable links to each of these concepts. When we go to these concepts, we can see the sources that were used. We can see our findings on that concept, right? We left this one pretty sparse, but there's more we can talk about. There's whole journals focused on the concept of biodiversity, but for what we needed today, this is all we needed. So now if we go back to our graph view, everything is tied together here. We have our question leading the investigation. We have our concepts, and we could add another concept to this, right? If we wanted to go deeper, we could look at what an ecological function actually is, right? We can look at what about rainforests? What about coral reefs? So we could go further. We might in a future episode revisit this question and see where we end up. But we have 4 different sources that we pulled in. We have a couple of concepts that someday we might use again. And if they do get used, they will link back to the question that we're currently working on. Right? And that's basically the process. this is how we answer questions. So the goal for this channel is to every day or every week or every other week, depending on how long it takes us to answer the questions, pick a question more or less at random. These ideally are going to be questions that I'm not already very comfortable in. I want to learn new things doing this, so you can see what it looks like when I'm learning a new concept, when I'm learning a new idea. So I've got a list of questions that I have not yet researched, that I'm not going to research before I go live with them. And we will build this vault up over time as we go and see where we end up. We will watch this network of ideas grow. The next question will probably not connect to any of these notes, right? It'll be a separate cluster somewhere in this wide, wide space. But if we answer enough questions, and let's say I answer one every other week, in a year, that'll be like 25 questions. Some of them are going to connect. There's going to be some overlap sooner or later. And we can start seeing where different ideas come into touch with each other and how they connect to each other as we develop a broader and broader base of knowledge through this learning process. I'm going to leave us with this vault for a few minutes so you can just appreciate what it is that we've accomplished here. What have we done in these 2 episodes? And this is a solid starting point. So with that, thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to leave this up for another minute or 2, and I will see you next week.